Go.
Hi, I'm Ian McFarland, founder and chairman at NEO.
Okay, so Ian, for those at home, obviously you are someone who's had big influence on the sort of agile community and their methodology. So you want to tell us a little bit about your background from there?
So let's see, sure. I've been around the tech space since before the web and got involved in the agile development space about 10 years ago now. Not that long after the whole thing started. And it's been really interesting sort of watching that whole adoption cycle. When I first started doing agile, it was one of those things where you had a lot of convincing to do to show people that there was something different about this methodology and that it would actually impact what was, they would have a meaningful material impact on what you were doing. And people thought it was weird that you do like pair programming or test-driven development. So we had a lot of these ideas that we had to explain why, like we had to help convince people that there was a possibility that there was any value in them before we could even start to do the work.
Yeah.
And I think that's, anytime there's some big disruptive change, people who have an old worldview are going to have a lot of difficulty sort of accepting that this has a meaningful impact on them, or it can, because they're used to doing things in a certain way, and they've developed their way of doing things. It's not that their way of doing things is uninformed. It's just that when you bring a new insight to these same problems and look at them through a different lens, the world looks different. And so it's really uncomfortable for people to shift from from one way of doing something to a new way of doing something, because all their instincts are based on their old model. And so it feels weird to be more concerned about, like with Lean, to be more concerned about learning than about shipping. I mean, and of course you are concerned about shipping. You're concerned about shipping in small increments. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to shorten that feedback cycle between getting something, like having the idea of what you're trying to build and validating that it is actually something meaningful.
Yep.
With Agile, it was very much the same way, where we were trying to, again, shorten feedback cycles. It was really just on the development side where we're trying to say, okay, we want to make sure that we built something that actually works. We didn't really think too much from the Agile perspective around what product we were building. We were thinking about how do we build it well and how do we build it flexibly so that when requirements change magically from outside, that we could continue to build good software. And because we did things in a different way, it felt strange to people when they would look at how we did things, and it was uncomfortable for people. So I think there was a lot to learn in terms of just how do we tell the story of why this thing that's so radically different produces better outcomes, and it isn't just an interesting way to do things or isn't just a fad. I think one of the things that I learned to do is talk about how these things come from emergent properties of software, or emergent properties of products. That if you look at early days of XP, like Kent talks about how we'd start from an early, take all these things that we knew were good, like we knew that testing was good, so, and then we'd do it all the time, like we would ramp it up. We would say, oh, testing is really good, so we're going to do it all the time. In fact, we're going to write tests first. We know that being able to deploy rapidly is good, so we're going to deploy in short and short increments. In fact, we're going to deploy every time we make a meaningful change to the code. When you tie it back to these sort of original principles and tie it back to sort of value-based ideas, it gives people a little bit of a thing to trust. You kind of have to show your work when you're doing something new and show that this mechanism is going to produce some real value. Because they are taking a big leap of faith. They have a methodology that they're following, whether it's an explicit or an implicit one. And they're doing it not because they're stupid, they're doing it because they're trying to produce a result. And the tools that they have are the best tools that they know in order to do that. And so when you're giving them a whole new set of tools, it's going to be really uncomfortable. It's going to be a really big sort of impact on their way of working.
So what are the ways that you found have really kind of illustrated that to people who have that resistance? So I understand you show by doing,
right,
but there's the problem of being able to be allowed to do it in the first place.
Right. And I think that depends a lot on who you're engaging with, what part of the process they're connected to. it's important to get that sort of sponsorship early from the people who are making those ultimate decisions. They have to sort of buy into, hey, we're going to do things in a different way. We aren't going to have we're not going to present a business plan at the beginning of the process and then execute on it until this number turns true, right? So a lot of that's about education early in the process and giving you good examples of similar businesses that have been impacted and trying to create that mental model for them so that they trust a little bit that this is going to have the impact that we say it's going to, and then demonstrating that on an ongoing basis. So I mean, that's critical in anytime you're doing something new, you're going to be held to a higher standard than somebody doing stuff in the old way.
So I'm assuming those conversations for you've been involved in this for 10 years now, have become easier to have with people.
Oh, sure.
So what is the difference, and like where are we going forward from here? Everyone, there is a broad understanding and a more and more common understanding of things like lean and agile.
Sure.
So where does that lead into the future?
Actually, before I answer that, I think one thing let's talk about the past a little bit. I think one of the things that I think is really helpful is to connect this future state that we know intimately from doing it a lot, how it could feel, to the current state.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that, I think the one thing that people get wrong when they're trying to promote a new way of thinking is to forget how well motivated the people they're talking to are, and really we lose when we don't have good empathy for the people that we're trying to teach, right? Like when you're teaching a first grader how to write, you don't tell them that, oh, I can't believe that you're not writing. you know that they don't know how to, and I'm not trying to sort of infantilize people either, because again, these are people that have a lot of knowledge about their business domain, or they have a lot of expertise that's really valuable. So it's like being able to connect to that good intent that they bring to it. I think that empathy for that core intent of everybody's trying to produce good quality stuff. People feel better when they produce something valuable. So connecting that to the new thing that we see, like we know how to go about building a product by talking to customers. We know what a good open-ended interview question is. Because we do it all the time. But when you're doing it the first time, you don't know how to do it well, and so you're going to do it not very well. But it doesn't mean that you're stupid. It just means that you haven't been exposed to it yet. So I think trying to connect that and come from a place of empathy and understanding, I think you can have the best methodology in the world, but it has to fit in the organization that is trying to be adapted to.
Yeah, so that kind of harks back to what we were discussing earlier around the dogma and the kind of the way that a lot of people have embraced these methodologies, and that's great. But their understanding of it is to go by a script.
That's right. Embraced is maybe they understand that they need to be doing it, but they don't necessarily understand what it is yet. And so you end up with sort of a lot of cargo culting. You end up with people going through these steps of producing a certain outcome from a book, but not adapting it to their local environment. And what ends up happening, sadly, and I mean, it's really good that there's a lot of mind share around. People know that lean startup is an important thing and that they should try to figure out how to implement their businesses along more lean principles. But if you just do it the way somebody else did it from the book, you end up with something that isn't actually working for your organization, and then the problem is that the actual methodology gets discredited. We would see this in the agile space all the time, and it's very well established now that agile development methodologies, they're becoming the dominant software development methodology. So they clearly work. But what we would hear all the time is like, oh, I tried to write tests for my thing, but this isn't testable, and so it doesn't really work very well. Or we're going agile, we stopped writing documentation. And so it's like, you actually have to do it well for it to have an impact. And so you see people doing it poorly and then talking about their failures at it, and they're treating their failure as a failure of the methodology, and then the methodology is only as good as the implementation.
So what do you, and this might be an impossible question to answer, but what do you think is the most fundamental lesson you can learn about this? That the thing that you can't not understand in order to implement it?
That's a good question. Well, I think one thing that people don't realize is how much they need to they need to be sensitive to being wrong. The hardest lesson to learn is to appreciate hearing that your idea is wrong. Because that has, like, we're trained as kids that, to be praised for when we have a correct idea. But the fact is, if you can learn one thing about entrepreneurship or around really trying to shorten this feedback cycle, it's that you don't want to wait until the market tells you that your product's no good. If you can find, the earlier that you can find out that you're doing something that's not interesting or that's not meaningful, the less time you're going to waste on something that's not that great, and the more time you can invest in tuning your idea so that you do come up with something that's really, really good. We get a lot of ego investment in sort of, we like our ideas. We get really attached to our ideas. So it feels scary we don't want to find out that our idea is no good. But if you really think about it, like, finding out that your idea is no good early in the process gives you your whole rest of your life to figure out better ideas and things that can work better. So, I think that's, to me, if you can learn one thing about the lean startup ethos and the lean startup ideas, it's really that feedback, that finding out that you're wrong is the biggest gift that anybody can give you.
Okay, and that's great. Probably where we can end it. Thanks.
Yeah, sure thing.
Thanks.
Great to talk to you.